I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorate. On this episode, I have a conversation with Chyrl Laird. Chyrl Laird is a professor and political analyst who specializes in race and ethnic politics and political psychology, and she joins me to discuss her new book titled Steadfast Democrats: How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior. She co-authored the book along with Ismail White, and in it they analyze historical data to better understand why Black Americans are by far the most unified racial group in American politics. In our conversation, Chyrl Laird and I draw parallels to the historical examples from the book, and we correlate them to more recent political events, like, of course, the Democratic primaries, for instance. This is a book that I personally will have to read more than once. It's that important. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Chyrl Laird. Chyrl Laird, welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I just have to say, when I was reading this book as a Black woman, it was really interesting because I was basically reading an analysis of my own political behavior. And I've never actually read it examined in this way. So it was really strange for me to read this. And because I don't think that much about my own political motivations, right? Like, I think about policy, but I don't think, why am I a Democrat? Why have I always been a Democrat? And why do I never question that, right? And so that was really interesting for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's literally what Ismail and I are trying to do with this book. And we also are African American and are trying to speak from an experience of understanding politics in a particular way. And often I think the literature thus far in some of the fields of political science, even sociology and other areas where they examine behavior, and even in this case, political behavior, we haven't really seen something that takes on this kind of question, and particularly like why is a group of people doing this thing the way that they're doing it, and we're able to really tackle it in a political science sort of way, but a lot of it is based off of our own lived experience as African Americans and an understanding that politics works differently.
Yeah, and so the thing is, you open the book with the Alabama Senate race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. We all remember that race for some really terrible reasons because of the allegations around Roy Moore. But what keeps happening in elections like this is that people try to analyze and predict Black voter behavior, right? They have all of these assumptions that aren't right. And then what happens is that Black voters end up surprising them like they did in this election. I think 98% of Black women voted for Doug Jones. And it was following that when Tom Perez made this statement online that Black women were the backbone of the party. And I think that was the first time that someone at that level of leadership, the head of the DNC, made a declaration like that and acknowledged that publicly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like it is clear that the partisan norm is very strong. The loyalty to the party is incredibly significant, and is defining to the party itself and its success in numerous elections. And I think the Alabama election would just put that into high relief. Like you were just able to really see that at work, and Black women being like the people at the front lines of it, not only in the voter box, but also on the ground. Like they were the ones, shepherding the grassroots efforts on the ground. They were the ones behind a lot of the poll, like souls to the polls, or gathering people up to get them to go vote, informing people about what was going on. And so they're there doing that work for the party and often just don't get acknowledged for it.
So what actually happened in that race? Why wasn't it as predictive as people thought? Alabama is typically a red state. Was it the mobilization on the ground that happened?
I think it's mobilization. So like the context of the election, right? So we have two individuals, Roy Moore and Doug Jones, and Roy Moore has especially this incident that comes up about some sexual impropriety, right? Like this situation of basically pedophilia as part of the conversation. But I also think part of the reason why people didn't see it coming is that this speaks a lot to the data that gets collected that goes into the predictive models of elections, which is the sample sizes often in those data are very small when it comes to the African American sample. And so if you do not have very good data that is large in terms of the size of the Black sample that's in it, additionally, that is broad in that it's not just focused in any one location, but is spread across sets of Black communities, the predictive nature then of what you're going to get from that data is not going to be right. Like a selection bias can create a problem with that. Additionally, I think people also don't know of some of the resources that African Americans are often dealing with in this case. If we look at in political science, the way that African Americans participate in politics, all of the indicators that we typically use, things like education level, income, all typically are things that would say what is likely for someone to participate. African Americans have to make up for all of that because they're very resource deprived, especially in a place like Alabama. And so what you then have to rely on are Black institutions, right? So Black churches, Black colleges, Black organizations become the front line for trying to mobilize people. And again, most types of tapping of that information through polling or through other forms of assessment, if you don't know about that, you wouldn't know where to go look for it. And so people didn't. They didn't know to go look there. They didn't know that people would be energized in this election with these circumstances at play to get themselves out to vote, and that the partisan role of that vote would matter so much.
Right. So do you think that's true nationally, that Black people are underrepresented in polling generally?
I think they are. I think that's how you get often polls. For instance, I remember not too long ago, the president had cited to a poll where he said he thought he had a whole bunch of Black people who were supportive of him, right? It was something like 30% of Black people saying they were okay with Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Immediately, my thought was, I need to see the data. Like I need to see because I want to know where the poll was taken. Is this a random sample poll? Is this a poll that is targeted to Black communities? Are you targeting this poll to Black people at a certain location? Like, was this taken at a convention of some sort? Like, all of that would matter because it's going to skew the data. And if you're not attentive to this in the sampling that you're doing and weighting the sampling and the size of it, so oftentimes really it has to do with the size of the sample. Often in a poll of maybe 1,000 or 1,300 people, in terms of African Americans that are in that sample, you'll be lucky if you see 100 people in it.
Wow. Well, so you talk a lot about Black political ideology. And I think another thing that's misunderstood about the Black voting bloc is just how conservative they are, like socially conservative in a lot of ways. Right. And I think it's because there's this confusion around, we are generally in allegiance to a non-conservative party.
No, I think that's right. I think because we think of ideology, and in political science, typically the conservative liberal ideology spectrum that we have is used heavily to predict partisanship. And in most literature, which is often used basically assessing white Americans, what we find is that people's ideology is very predictive of their partisanship, especially in a polarized environment. But for African Americans, it's different, right? And I think part of that has to do with how ideology works for African Americans. Black people are very politically diverse in their views. I say that again. Black people are very politically diverse in their views, right? The partisan behavior needs to be thought about much more from a strategic advantage that the group is trying to do to be able to be a minority group in a majority system and having a voice. But people have varying opinions. And a lot of people are very conservative, especially on things like social conservatism, fiscal conservatism, religiosity often is a driving force. And we know from data, especially from like Pew Research Center, they find that African Americans as a racial group are some of the most strongest actors when it comes to their engagement of religious institutions. And those religious institutions are also African American, right? Like this is like Martin Luther King talking about the most segregated day of the week is Sunday, right? Like that is where they are, and it still is true. So conservatism manifests differently for Blacks. And ideologically, it also is very shaped by race, where the goals of what people are leaning into in terms of their ideology could have a lot more to do with what they believe is important for trying to improve the status of the group, even if they are varying in how they believe one would try to approach that. But at the end of the day, the partisanship, though, is done in a manner that is trying to elevate the voice of the Black community and political power in a space where we are in a majority-based system.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about that is that it's almost subconscious, right? Like we don't necessarily, like myself, I don't think necessarily about my role in this larger picture of like what we're trying to do collectively, but we just do it. We just do it.
We just do it. And it's interesting because Ismail and I, when we've presented on this before, we like to use this episode of Blackish. I think it's called like Black Elephants in the Room or something to that effect. And it's about their son Junior, Andre and Bo's son Junior, deciding that he wants to join like the Young Black Republicans Club at school or something. And Andre is stunned and he's trying to explain it to his family members and they all can't understand. So he's trying to explain it to Bo, he's trying to explain it to his mother. And they're both like, what do you mean he wants to join a republic? He wants to be a Like he wants to be the Republicans, like he wants to go to Banana Republic and buy clothes. Like they can't even process it because you're right. It has become such a part. Like to be Black is to be Democrat, and people who seem to be different from that are seen as strange, right? But I think it speaks so heavily to how long this norm of collective group-based behavior has been informing Black political behavior over time, right? And it's not just limited to the Democratic partisanship we have now, right? In other parts of the book, we talk about it at various points in history where you see organizing of the group as a collective and an understood group interest having come to the forefront, and how the group then uses the numbers that we have and organizing them to behave in a way that tries to maximize the group interests the best. And it's unspoken almost after a while, because now it's known. Like we just understand it, you do it, you wouldn't question it, which means it's very effective.
Yeah, but here's the interesting thing. The commitment to partisanship with Black Americans, it often supersedes race. You use this really interesting example of a survey that was done of Black Americans and whether they would vote for Ben Carson on the Republican ticket over Hillary Clinton on the Democratic ticket. And overwhelmingly, they would choose, in the survey, hypothetical survey, they would choose Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, no, they do, because I think because it's beyond the racial factor, especially for somebody like Ben Carson, because I think people, although he's Black, right, they're like, yeah, but he's like different, like he's that he's not Black. I think every Black person probably knows somebody who is very heavily conservative leaning, if not actually Republican in some way, maybe at a distance, or someone in the family, but they would not put the fact that they are Black over the fact that their partisan leaning is different from what the group has kind of put forth as the way in which we've been able to successfully get issues of the group addressed, right? And particularly with the Democratic Party, right? This goes back to the Civil Rights Movement and the legislation that comes out under that period of time, and the work and the collaboration there then with the Democratic president to make that happen, to even the realization, right? The actual granting of Black people into the governing structures like Congress, and even the presidency happening all through the Democratic Party. So Ben Carson is not going to be picked over Hillary Clinton. Like Hillary Clinton, even though she is white, is still a Democrat, and that matters. In fact, people are probably looking at Ben Carson and questioning, like, well, why Republican though? For someone like Ben Carson, I think is uniquely interesting because he was so heralded in the Black community. Right before his partisanship was known, he was Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon, right? Like he separated the twins. I remember my mother buying gifted hands, and when my brother like fell off at one point in his teenage life, she was like, read the book. And like, so to see him make that shift, it's like, oh my God, like you actually were somebody that we really held in high acclaim. And now we're struggling because your partisan loyalty is just not consistent with what we believe in.
Right. Was there a shift, or did we just not know? I think.
Yeah, we just not know. Like, it's like, what? Like, we just had no idea. Like, you were there? You've been there the whole time?
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I say that too. I mean, my family is Seventh-day Adventist. And so, like, in the Seventh-day Adventist church and the Black people within that space, I mean, he was massive, right? Because he too is Seventh-day Adventist. And so, yeah, like amongst Black church going people I know, they were like, I'm so confused.
We're all still confused. So, I mean, that's another thing about reading this book that was really interesting as a Black woman. That's another decision that I hadn't really, that wasn't conscious for me. Like I would never vote for Ben Carson, and I didn't really think about why. And it's just like, well, he's got that R in his chest, and I just wouldn't go there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The R is a huge signifier of something. And even now, even now we haven't gotten necessarily this election yet, but I would say for someone even like Bernie Sanders, who runs as an independent, and has been an independent congressman for an extended period of time. And I'm like, the absence of the D is also an issue for him. Like, and I don't think that that's been talked about as much, but I'm like, the Democratic acknowledgement, like saying that you are a member of the Democratic Party, is important for African Americans because we are members. We're not just like some days we're with it and some days we're not. When it comes to federal level elections, especially when it comes to the presidency, we are there lockstep. with the Democratic Party and our members. We are part of the primary contest and we're part of the general elections. So to not have that marker, like, you don't have to explain why. Like, you're and you're gonna have a bigger hill to climb, I think, to reach them, even if they agree with some of your policies, even ideologically.
Yeah, and you know what, you read my mind. That was my very next question, because I was wondering if it worked the same way on the far left. And like, a lot of Black people, a lot of Black voters have very, very progressive views and progressive values. You know, they may like Bernie Sanders' policies, right? But the problem is, and he hasn't been able to make these inroads in the Black community, is that we understand, or we know what a Democrat looks like by their lifetime of allegiance or commitment to the party. And I think that's a problem. It's almost like an uncanny valley. Like, you can't just put the D on short term and then take it off. Like, we can see that. We may not articulate it all the time, but Black voters do see that.
They do see that. And I think that is often why I get frustrated in some of the conversations I have heard people have around African Americans and their decision making in this election contest at this point, because it assumes a lack of knowledge, right? I hear a lot of people saying, well, they just don't know. I've had even people email me after I've done a couple of interviews and say, well, you know, do Black people know? Do you know? And I'm like, no, we definitely know. Like, we and there is low knowledge in the population broadly construed, just amongst Americans generally, right, when it comes to elections. So that's just a given. But African Americans are individuals who are having to navigate a system where they are heavily constrained, heavily marginalized, coming out of circumstances that are incredibly challenging, and their ability to be able to have the type of say and influence that they're having in the political system speaks volumes to the strategic nature in which they are doing this thing that seems so simple that we don't even think about it, right? But it's huge, it's massive. And so I don't feel it's good to underestimate that. And I think Bernie Sanders' campaign, although it has African Americans working within it, I think they may be underestimating the importance of that, because you can agree with him on policies and still be questioning of it, because the Democratic loyalty isn't there. And also, I think some of his conversations, even with respect to race, is something that also comes to play. So you have these two things working together, where you have then Joe Biden, who is an elder in the party. He is a known in the party. And for many African Americans, and from some of the polling I've seen, right, not only is getting a Democrat into office important, but they really want Donald Trump to be gone. And so they're trying to make an assessment, like, how much do I prioritize interests that may be more leaning towards my progressivism, for instance, versus, but I need Trump out of office, and I need to get a Democrat in there who's going to be able to do that. And who do I think will do it? Well, I might think Biden is, right? And I might be risk averse, right, to gambling on somebody who may align more with my progressive leanings than one that I think would be more likely to be able to win the contest.
Right. But I want to go back to a point you made earlier about the conservative nature of Black views, right? The conservative ideology, right? And how that doesn't align with, the commitment to the Democratic Party. So one of the things that you point out is the fact that generally Black people, and I think this shift happened in the 70s, don't necessarily support government-sponsored programs, like government-sponsored, job guarantee programs, for instance. And that shift happened kind of in the early aughts, the early 2000s. Like, what happened there?
So I think one thing we see are diverging lived experiences for African Americans, right? So one thing that kind of created a collective group consciousness speaks a lot to the ways in which people were segregated into communities together. Things like Jim Crow, things that were defining to Black life for basically anybody at any income bracket, and the income bracket differences and economic differences weren't that significant. Now, over time, that is starting to change, right? And we are starting to see, like, there are more Black people who are in the top 20% percentile than we used to see, and that's increasing, and that's creating gaps economically in terms of where people are. Education differences are starting to become more acute, and more African Americans are leaving out of potentially Black spaces spaces than we had in the past and being put in more integrated environments. And we would argue then that people who may have been conservative leaning on some of these positions are feeling more comfortable with having those discussions or having more signing to those views more explicitly, because they are in social networks and social spaces where they feel comfortable doing that, right? And so that may lead them to be that way. And then in some cases, it may just be that people are literally just there. They are just more conservative in their view, for any number of reasons. It could be things about government involvement in trying to resolve certain types of issues. It could be economic conservatism. Those individuals just could be there and be present. And there is some literature in the field, like Melissa Harris Perry, as well as Michael Dawson, in political science, both have books that speak about Black ideology, right, and ideas about Black conservatism, and that there's something unique to that argument, right? Like we're thinking more like in the Booker T. Washington sense of conservatism, like economic uplift and racial uplift happening through like kind of your bootstrap models, right? Like that we can just pick ourselves up, pull ourselves up, and we don't need intervention. There are Black people who are ideologically leaning on that, who are more of conscious Blacks, like Blacks who are more about Black nationalism and believe that government intervention isn't something that's necessary because we need to turn within and we need to support Black businesses and Black schools and Black entities. And that's really how we would be able to move forward. And we shouldn't be looking at government. And so that also is being fed into some of those numbers that we're seeing. And I think over time, people are becoming more and more comfortable with expressing that, especially as the lived experience has changed.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So what do you think was the defining moment or the pivotal moment for Black Americans being kind of tied to, for decades and decades to the Democratic Party? Was it the passage of the Civil Rights Act followed by the Voting Rights Act? Was that the pivotal moment?
I think that's a big part of it, right? I think that, and simultaneously, right, you also have like the Southern strategy being invoked by the Republican Party, right? You see a partisan behavior that is going on from the elites within both parties where in LBJ, it's a complicated man, right? Like, it's not as if he was like walking towards the civil rights movement stuff like open arms, right? Like that was like a push very hard. And he himself had viewpoints that were not necessarily that favorable towards African Americans. But it was clear that the Democratic Party seems to be the party that is taking the action on civil rights, and the Republican Party, Southern strategy, Dixiecrats, and those who are moving within underneath now this new Republican wing, right, are people who are openly saying that they are anti-civil rights, right? So they are signaling. So whatever questions one may have had at that point is starting to now take shape, right, in more clear form that they are anti-civil rights policy. And at that time, and then now, and that the Democrats are more pro-civil rights policy. And then from there, you see then that the opportunities then when we see, for instance, the earliest members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including people like Shirley Chisholm and other individuals at that time, right, they're all Democrats, right? So the opportunities then for African Americans to gain access to the governing structure in numbers is starting to happen through Democratic seats. And then we see that going on further, right, with the expansion that we have in 1992 with the majority minority districts that come out of the Supreme Court decisions, that then allows for more African Americans to be able to gain access to Congress seats, and they are Democrats. And that's a huge thing as well. So you can see over time, while the Republican Party is not doing the same. So it's not only the Democrats are getting behind these things, even if they're not at the best version of what maybe would be wanted, but the Republican Party doesn't seem to be doing any of that. And it's a two-party system. Consolidation happens in a way where if we're going to continue to use the behavior of the collective, like the group, working together to be able to have influence in this big political system, it seems to be that we need to consolidate within the party that seems the most favorable to what we want. They may not be doing everything we want, but they seem to be the most favorable to what we want.
Right. That's another point that people bring up. Another, I guess, criticism of Black voters is that, when you imply that Black voters as a voting bloc are more ignorant than the population at large, that doesn't necessarily endear them to your movement. But also, the fact that, people keep making this point that, we're kind of voting against our interests, right? That, we're voting for a party that hasn't made a lot of gains for us policy wise. And I don't know, how do you explain that?
So, African Americans are pragmatic. Like they are very pragmatic people, especially older Blacks, right? You're dealing with a pragmatic set of individuals. I think what people are not understanding is Black people have been living in a country in a marginalized position since they've arrived, like 1619 Project, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, like when we thinking about where we're coming from, they've been in that position. And they have had to recognize that time and time again, that when they thought that the revolution was going to happen, it hasn't happened necessarily. Like everything has taken time, like from the time of Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education that overturns Plessy versus Ferguson is like 100 years. Like this is not something that happens overnight. So they are very thoughtful in their expectations, right? I don't think they believe that a revolution will just happen because we elect this one person. I think they are much more pragmatic and thinking in ways that are like, look, what we need is this to occur. We need this particular thing to happen. We want a Democrat in office. We want a Democrat in office that can beat the now incumbent Republican president. We need to do that with somebody that we know that we can at least trust or understand and that we know that individual fairly well. We have some idea of where they're coming from. They may not be the best individual that we want, but again, we have to weigh what we want at the end of the day against what we are being presented with. And so this is then the decision that one is making, right? And in addition to the fact that many people also would just align with Joe Biden, especially with older Black voters, like they aren't that far apart ideologically, I would say, from a moderate Democrat, which is what I would define Joe Biden as. And so Bernie Sanders is not really reaching those individuals in the same way. And people are making it seem as if people are voting against their own interest, when in fact, they are literally thinking in terms of their interest because they recognized over history and over time that this is how this works. This is how this happens. And to kind of aim for something that seems more radical, even if you ideologically agree with it, is the more risky option in a situation where you need something to occur immediately. Like they don't want the Republican president to win a second term.
Right. So, so here's something that I haven't been able to understand or explain. There are other racialized minorities in this country that don't have the same commitment to the Democratic Party that Black voters do, but who would benefit from having greater, commitment to the Democratic Party. And thinking about that pivotal moment, the Civil Rights Act passing and the Voting Rights Act passing, a lot of people of color who live in this country now have benefited from those gains. Yet they still don't have that commitment. And I can't necessarily, I can't explain that.
I think it has a lot to do with the socialization and the social network argument that we talk about in the book, because I think for African Americans, right, racial segregation has done a lot of work for this party norm. A lot of work, right? We actually argue it's like foundational to how this has occurred, because it is in these segregated spaces that not only does this norm of partisan loyalty get understood and it gets informed by what is being deemed to be best for the group interest, it is then reinforced by Black institutions. It is also then reinforced by Black social networks, like the people you talk to. Like, so if you are in social networks with people that are predominantly Black, you will feel pressure to behave in the way that aligns with the group if you were demonstrating a behavior that seemed to be in disalignment with the partisan norm, or if you were someone who you might yourself be somebody who's looking at somebody else and thinking that it seems strange because we all know what we're supposed to do, and so you're different than that. And other groups just don't have necessarily that going for them. I think part of that has to do with how their identities have become formed in the United States, right? So for the Latino, Latinx community, right, it's complicated because it's an ethnic group, not really a race by census definitions. However, they are in enclaves together. But those enclaves are often based off like national origin, right? So Mexicans and enclaves together, or Dominicans or Guatemalans or Salvadorians and communities together, which doesn't. So really, what they have to then coalesce around would have to be the pan-ethnic identity of being Latinx, and that is something that identifying with Latinx is not immediate for people, especially people who are just arriving, right? That's something that you would have to be socialized into from being in the United States and experiencing discrimination that you would define as something as I'm being discriminated against because I'm Latino. And like that's not as easy to do, especially for people who are highly identified with their national origin, even as they are being able to benefit from things that have come into legislatively wise have come into law that have been done by the Democratic Party. And in some cases, some communities are kind of just getting into a space again where the identity is being seen as this pan-ethnic, pan-national identity. For reason for Asian Americans, right? That's another one. And again, some of the research on this talks about people's identification with a pan-ethnic identity, like Asian, or, and that's also pan-racial, but like a racial identity or a pan-ethnic identity like that, or Latino, happens after people experience something like discrimination, for instance, or are of a particular education level. So it takes time. And so the fact that we don't see it happening for other groups, I think in part speaks to not only diversity of those groups, but the difficulty of creating that collective identity to see oneself as this overarching umbrella group that you're then going to act on politically because you understand what the norm is of the group. But we're starting to see some shifts happening, right? Because I think disproportionately Latinos and Asian communities, for instance, vote with the Democratic Party. But there's still way more diversity there than we see for African Americans by far.
Yeah, that's actually, I was thinking back on the 2016 election. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I was really surprised to see there is quite a big gap between, Latino women, for instance, just as an example, and Black women. I think it was something like 60% versus like 94% for Black women. And I'll have to go back to get those numbers, but it isn't close.
It isn't close. And I think it does speak a lot to what's going on in people's social surroundings, right? Because I think if we look at Latino men and we're thinking about households, especially if we're thinking about households, for instance, where it's a male-female headed household, right? So it's a couple that is male-female, right? That women would potentially be in households with men who are also were supportive of, for instance, President Trump, because Latino men supported Trump. A large amount of them supported Trump in terms of their vote. And so they too may not be feeling some of the social cues about behavior that we see happen for the Black community, where even in your own home, the click into the norm of political behavior for partisanship is there, right? Because oftentimes those homes are, even if it's two Black people, regardless of gender even, right? Like it's understood. It's understood, right? And even those who depart from the norm, right? Those who identify as Black Republicans, they are aware that they are departing from the norm. Like they are not blind to it. Like they totally know, and they talk about it. They're like, I don't like that I'm being called a sellout. I don't like that I'm being called an Uncle Tom. I don't like that I'm being seen as a race traitor. But those sanctions, although one can definitely question if it's problematic, the nature in which they exist, right, are part of the strategy of trying to create a collective action behavior, right? Like social sanctioning is what is allowing for that. Like you worry about the relationships you have with other Black people, other people friends, family, and if they knew you were doing something that seems to be out of step with what the norm of expectations in terms of how the group will be is supposed to happen. And if you do, then you know. But like you're fully aware, and I think Corey Field's book Black Elephants in the Room, and even Leo Wright Rigueur's book on Black Republicans, Loneliness of the Black Republican, both speak to that, right? The people's awareness of this and the evolving space of the Republican Party and Black ties to it, because at one point in history, Blacks were Republicans, right? And we saw the collective behavior get applied to that party, but then there was a partisan shift.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean they do know it because they have to come up with special hashtags like dim exit.
Right. Yeah, like Blexit, Demexit, right? And what I think is interesting as well, even especially with like Candace Owens and Kanye West and the critiques that they make of Black people, and even Ben Carson, I think, has talked about Herman Cain too, like this use of Black people being on a plantation, the Blexit. They are still making appeals that are group based. So I'm like, so you guys do know, you're fully aware of the racial dynamic that's happening here because you're not just coming after anybody who's a Democrat. You're coming after Blacks, right? And you're calling out Black people, which you are a member of the group, and you're making a group-based appeal, like to say that Black people are on a plantation. So you're tying that to slavery, right? Like, so you guys know what you're doing in terms of why you're saying what you're saying the way you're saying it. And this is not just some broad-based pitch that the Republican Party is better, but you're specifically speaking to African Americans and what they are doing, even as you're saying that you are different from them. Like you're still,
Yeah.
but you're still part of it. Like you're still, like you're still
Yeah.
part of it. In fact, you're appealing to it directly. And in Candace Owens' organization, I think her book organization is called like Talking Points, I want to say, to even have the Black young people come to the White House in the MAGA hats, right? I'm like, so it's Black Republicans, right? So again, here you're working within the group, a group behavior. And it makes sense to me that she's able to appeal to younger Blacks more than likely than older Blacks, because I'm like, well, younger Blacks may not have as much reinforcement of the norm in their space, especially if they're in college. They may be in colleges or spaces where there are more whites around them. And so the social network's more diverse. And so enforcement of the norm is not as much. Or they've created their own social network of Black Republicans that have made them feel comfortable with this. But I think over time, some of it might wane for some of those individuals because the relationships that they have with Blacks beyond that group may start to peter out because they've associated themselves with this.
So if you were to craft a campaign and you wanted to, attract, the Black voting bloc, what would be the ingredients, right? So we know that you can't be incentivized by, purely a policy-driven campaign, just only that, right? You have to have a D by your name. And also, as seen in this election, being Black isn't enough, right? Cory Booker and Kamala Harris were in the race. So what are the perfect ingredients to craft that campaign?
So I think you have to craft a campaign that clearly, yes, is like tied heavily within the party structure, right? The D needs to be there. I think the person needs to show that they are able to appeal to a broad base of voters, which I think is something that Bernie Sanders is also struggling with, right? He is so far to the left, I think, in how people are perceiving him, and he himself defining himself as somewhat of a socialist, that people are worried, like, well, then how are you going to get the moderate white voter, right? Like, this isn't just African Americans voting for the Democrats, right? You have to vote. You have to appeal to everybody. And I think even for Barack Obama, I think that was a big part of what people needed to see happen for him, that he needed to demonstrate a viability and electability that moves beyond the African American community and actually would be something that would be effective amongst whites, especially even like white moderates, right? Can he make those appeals? And so that would be something that'd be important as well. I think the context of the election would matter more. So I think Cory Booker and Kamala Harris could do. I'm glad they were in the race, and that they signal a diversity and a shift in the kinds of candidates that we'll see going forward. But I also think that people may be making a risk assessment with them at this moment because the context of this election, it's not as if they're coming in as a challenger like Barack Obama is coming in 2008 against somebody who is not a sitting president, right? You're coming in against an incumbent, right? So we have a sitting president that you're going up against. And so now, does one want to take the risk of trying to see if we can again get another Black president? I mean, I think we all thought the success of Barack Obama was fantastic for those who are Black Democrats, which is most of them. But at the same time, right? Like the idea that it would happen again and be what happens in the particular circumstance we are in, probably too far to the left, right? It's too progressive, and there are already challenges that Kamala and Cory were facing going in with that. So I think that would be something that they'd have to consider, as well as speaking to issues on race. Like I think we're seeing a lot more discussion around race issues, way more than we used to, and I think that's partly because the party is recognizing that you can't win these elections without Black voters turning out and Black voters feeling your candidate, and that you need to be able to be good at tying yourself to Black institutions and Black individuals that are respected in the community that can speak to your, like, basically serve as a endorsement, right, for your legitimacy, especially if you're an unknown or a person that had not previously had ties. I think that's something that Elizabeth Warren struggled with coming out of Massachusetts. I think that's something that Bernie Sanders struggles with coming out of Vermont. But Joe Biden, being the vice president from the first Black president, Jim Clyburn's endorsement, his own ties to many of the organizations, especially in the South, where you have a lot of African Americans, all served hugely for him. And those connections matter. Like, the on the ground work, being on the ground, connecting to Black communities matters a lot. And so if you're not ready to do that, more than likely you will not be that successful in making those appeals.
Well, Chyrl Laird, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for writing this book. I think a lot of people could have used this book sometime last year when they started their campaigns. But, thank you. I'm glad it's here anyway.
Yes, thank you. It was great.
Thank you for listening. The Electorate is independently created and produced by me, Jen Taylor Skinner. And of course, I'm the host. But I also do all of the editing, the audio, and the graphics. You name it, it's on my plate. So if you enjoyed this episode of The Electorate, please help The Electorate grow by subscribing. Just hit the subscribe button on whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Also leave a review for The Electorate on iTunes. Lastly, one final way to help The Electorate is by following The Electorate on social media. That's @Electorate on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.